Hunter finds missing ranger's skeleton and chilling Bigfoot evidence after 7 years. It was supposed to be a normal elk hunt in Montana's Yak Valley. But instead of game, the hunter stumbled onto the one thing no one expected to see again. A torn Forest Service jacket, a rusted canteen, and bones scattered inside a crude shelter made from logs and branches. They belonged to a ranger who vanished without a trace 7 years earlier. But that wasn't the strangest part. Around the site were massive footprints sunk deep in the earth, far too wide, far too heavy to belong to any man. And as the hunter tried to leave, the forest itself seemed to close in. Wood knocks echoing at dusk, a musky odor drifting through the trees, the undeniable sense of being watched. If the ranger really died from exposure, then who, or what, arranged his gear so carefully? And why do the woods still feel claimed by something that doesn't want to be found? You found your way here for a reason. In a world that can feel overwhelming, it's the gentle hearts that bring light. And yours is one of them. I've been hunting these mountains since I was old enough to carry my father's spare rifle. 49 years living in Libby, Montana, and the Yak Valley still holds secrets I can't explain. Maybe that's why I stayed away from its deeper reaches these past few seasons, sticking to the familiar zones where cell service still whispers, through the pines, and where other hunters' trucks occasionally rumble past on logging roads. But this fall, 2022, something pulled me back to the remote northwestern corner. Perhaps it was the divorce papers finally going through last spring, or the empty house that seems to grow larger with each passing month. Out here, among the dense timber and knife-edge ridges, the silence feels purposeful rather than accusatory. I'd chosen my spot carefully, a steep north-facing slope where elk often bed down during the warmer portions of autumn days. The weather report had warned of an early winter system moving in from Canada within the week, which meant the herds would be feeding heavily, building up fat reserves before the first real snow. Perfect hunting conditions, if you could tolerate the bone-deep chill that settled into these valleys before dawn. My old Remington 30-06 felt solid against my shoulder as I worked my way up through a stand of mature Douglas fir. The rifle had belonged to my father, and his father before him. 3 generations of Hartleys had used it to put meat in the freezer. The familiar weight helped ground me as I picked my path between patches of wind-fallen timber and loose shale. The morning air carried that distinctive October brittleness, sharp enough to make your nose sting, heavy with the promise of snow. Above me, the ridgeline disappeared into a bank of low clouds. The forecast called for them to burn off by mid-morning, but mountain weather played by its own rules. I'd packed extra layers in my emergency shelter, just in case. My boots crunched quietly through a carpet of fallen needles as I paused to glass the slope ahead. The timber was thick here, old growth that had somehow escaped the logging operations that had carved up much of the surrounding forest. Massive trunks rose like columns in a cathedral, their branches weaving together 100 feet overhead. The canopy was so dense that even now, hours after sunrise, the forest floor remained wrapped in a grey half-light. This far back in, the modern world felt like a distant memory. No contrails scratched the patches of sky visible through the branches. No distant engine noise carried up from the valley. Just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional crack of a branch settling under its own weight. This was what I'd come for. Not just the elk, but this return to something fundamental. Out here, a man could remember who. He was beneath all the accumulated layers of civilization. Out here, the isolation that had been eating at me since Sarah left felt less like a burden and more like a tool for sharpening the senses. I paused to take a drink from my canteen and my eyes caught on an old weather-beaten notice board at the trail junction. Most of the postings had long since surrendered to rain and wind, but one fragment still clung stubbornly to its rusted staple. The paper was sun-bleached and warped, but I could make out part of a face. Daniel Price, the Forest Service ranger, who vanished up here in 2015. I remembered when they first put those flyers up. Price had been doing routine trail maintenance in this section of the Yak, radio checking in like clockwork until one day in late September, when his voice simply never came across the channels again. I'd been part of the initial search parties, dozens of us combing these ridges, calling his name into valleys that threw our voices back at us like mocking echoes. They found his truck parked at a remote trailhead, everything in perfect order. His gear was missing though: pack, radio, sidearm, all the essentials a ranger would carry on patrol. The search stretched from days into weeks. Helicopters swept the ridgelines with infrared cameras while teams of trackers worked the ground. But the yak kept its secret. No blood trail, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle. Price had stepped into these woods and simply ceased to exist. Some folks in Libby still talk about it in hushed tones over coffee at the diner. They'll tell you how Price was too experienced to just get lost, too well equipped to succumb to exposure. They'll mention how his final radio transmission had been routine. A simple check-in, noting he was investigating what he called an unusual structure, spotted off trail, the kind of thing rangers documented all the time. Old hunters' camps, crude shelters, abandoned equipment. The official report listed him as missing, presumed deceased, cause unknown. The Forest Service installed a small brass plaque at the district office, and life moved on. But every hunter who works these ridges knows Price's story. We all carry it with us, like an extra piece of gear we'd rather not need. I pulled the fragment of paper free, finally letting the last physical reminder of Price's disappearance drift away on the morning breeze. 7 years, and these woods had swallowed every trace of him except our memories. Even the old-timers who used to tell stories about strange calls in the night and massive tracks in remote meadows had grown quiet after Price vanished, as if speaking of such things might somehow make them more real. My watch showed just past 8 in the morning. The clouds were starting to thin, right on schedule. I adjusted my pack, checked my rifle's sling, and continued up the ridge. I had elk to find, and dwelling on old mysteries wouldn't fill my tag or my freezer. The morning dew had burned off the grass, making tracking more challenging. But I'd been reading elk signs since I was 12. Fresh droppings near a well-worn game. Trail told me I wasn't far behind. The herd had moved through here maybe 2 hours ago, heading up toward the higher meadows, where they'd likely bed down during the heat of the day. I worked my way along the edge of the valley, staying just inside the tree line, where the shadows kept the ground soft enough to hold prints. The tracks showed about 8 animals, mostly cows, but one set of impressions was deeper, wider, a bull, and a decent one by the spacing of his stride. The wind had been steady from the northwest all morning, perfect for keeping my scent away from anything ahead. But when it shifted, something else changed with it. I noticed it gradually at first, the way you sense a storm building before you see the clouds. The chickadees that had been chattering in the understory went quiet. No more wing beats in the canopy. No squirrels scolding from the safety of their perches. My father used to talk about moments like this when I was growing up. He called it a silence that isn't empty, but full. Said it was nature's warning system. When the small things go quiet, the big things are moving. I'd experienced it before stalking elk, when a mountain lion was working the same drainage, but this felt different, more complete. Even the wind seemed to die in my ears, leaving nothing but the sound of my own careful footsteps and breathing. I eased my rifle off my shoulder, more from instinct than any real concern. The morning's brightness suddenly felt thin, like a sheet stretched over something darker. My eyes kept wanting to check my periphery, drawn to the spaces between trees, where shadows pulled deeper than they should in mid-morning. The elk tracks continued ahead of me, but their pattern had changed. The neat, purposeful line of travel had scattered, as if the herd had suddenly split in multiple directions. Not running, there was no deep gouging in the soil that would indicate panic, but they definitely abandoned their original course. I crouched to study the sign more closely, running my fingers over the impression of a cleaved hoof. The track was sharp-edged, still fresh. But something made me hesitate to follow. Maybe it was the unnatural weight of the silence, or the way the hair on my neck refused to settle. Or maybe it was just the ghost of my father's voice, warning me about the wisdom of prey animals and the foolishness of ignoring their signals. The valley stretched ahead, a natural funnel between rising ridges. Good elk country, good hunting. But as I stood there in that strange, pregnant quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one doing the hunting. I found a decent vantage point on an outcrop where I could glass the opposite ridge. The morning sun had climbed high enough to illuminate the far slope, and I settled in with my binoculars, scanning methodically for the telltale brown shapes of bedded elk. The first sweep revealed nothing unusual, just the expected patchwork of evergreens and autumn gold aspens. But on my second pass, something caught my eye. About 300 yards across the drainage, a cluster of young lodgepole pines looked wrong. I adjusted the focus, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The saplings, maybe 15 or 20, of them were bent and broken at roughly chest height, not snapped clean through, but twisted and folded over, their tops pointing downslope. At first, I wrote it off as storm damage. We'd had some nasty weather blow through last month, but the longer I studied the pattern, the less that explanation sat right. When storms tear through these valleys, they leave a chaotic mess. Branches snap in random directions. Trees topple wherever their weight takes them. This was different. The damage formed a rough circle maybe 20 feet across. The broken trunks all bent the same way, like someone, or something, had methodically worked their way around the stand. I shifted position, trying to get a better angle. The morning light caught the pale splinters where the wood had been wrenched apart. Fresh breaks from the look of them. No darkening or weathering that you'd see from old damage. Whatever had done this had happened recently. My mind started cataloguing possibilities. Bears sometimes break saplings, but they do it while marking territory, clawing and biting the trunks, leaving strips of bark hanging. These were clean breaks, no shredding. Moose will tear up small trees during the rut, but they're messy about it. This had an unsettling precision to it. I found myself thinking about old stories I'd heard from loggers and trail crews, tales of finding structures in the backcountry, trees woven together into crude shelters, saplings bent into archways, branches arranged in ways that seemed deliberate. Most dismissed them as natural formations or the work of bored hikers, but a few of the old-timers would get quiet when the subject came up, especially after a few drinks. The rational part of my brain kept trying to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe some teenagers had come up here partying. Maybe someone was building a blind for hunting season. But those saplings were thick enough that breaking them would take serious force. And why do it in such a remote spot, far from any trails? I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, the broken trees were still there, their unnatural arrangement seeming to stand out even more sharply against the natural forest around them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at something purposeful, something that didn't belong. The afternoon light was already starting to fade when I noticed something that made me pause mid-stride. There, barely visible in the packed earth between two moss-covered logs, was the unmistakable impression of a boot print. It wasn't fresh. Time and weather had hardened the soil around its edges, preserving just the ghost of its shape. But it was human, and it was heading deeper, into the valley. I knelt down to study it closer. The tread pattern was consistent with standard-issue Forest Service boots, the kind they'd been using 7 years ago. My throat went dry as I considered the implications. Could these be Price's tracks? The timeline fit, and this was the general area where his last radio check-in had placed him. More prints emerged as I followed the direction of travel, each one subtle but present to an experienced eye. They traced a path that no casual hiker would choose, contouring along the steeper sections of the slope rather than fighting straight uphill. It was the route someone would take if they were systematically checking this drainage, exactly what a ranger would do on patrol. I checked my watch. I had maybe 2 hours of usable daylight left. The smart play would be to mark this location on my GPS and come back fresh tomorrow. but something about those prints drew me forward. Each one felt like a breadcrumb leading toward an answer to a question that had haunted these valleys for 7 years. The trail led me through a series of natural bottlenecks in the terrain, places where the ridges pinched together. It was efficient pathfinding, the kind of route someone with solid backcountry experience would choose. But it was also taking me deeper into the valley than I'd planned to go today, into sections I hadn't properly scouted. The air grew noticeably cooler as the path descended into a shadowed draw. Old-growth timber crowded in here, their massive trunks blocking what remained of the evening light. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs and thick ferns, but the boot prints continued, growing slightly more distinct in the damper soil. Paused to get my bearings, comparing the terrain to my topo map. I was well off my intended hunting route now, having followed these tracks for the better part of a mile. The valley ahead narrowed further, funneling into what looked like an even darker pocket of timber. The boot prints led straight toward it. My hand brushed the reassuring weight of my rifle sling. I still had my headlamp if darkness caught me, and enough supplies for an unexpected night out if things went sideways. But something about this place made my skin prickle. The forest felt different here, older, untouched, like I'd crossed some invisible boundary into a part of the valley that didn't welcome visitors. The boot prints led me to a small clearing where the trees thinned just enough to let in strips of the fading daylight. At first, I almost missed it. The structure blended so naturally with the surrounding forest that my eyes slid right past. But then I caught the deliberate pattern. Logs and branches, woven together at angles that nature doesn't create, forming a crude lean-to against the hillside. It was big, much larger than any hunting blind I'd ever constructed or encountered. The framework consisted of thick logs, some easily 8 inches in diameter, interlaced with smaller branches stripped of their bark. The construction showed purpose, but not the clean cuts of modern tools. The ends of the branches appeared torn, or twisted rather than sawn. My breath caught as I approached. There was something profoundly wrong about the structure. No hunter would build something this elaborate so far from any reasonable game trail. And the size. You could fit 3 or 4 people inside standing up. The entrance gaped like a dark mouth. I pulled out my headlamp, though part of me wanted to turn back to pretend I'd never found this place. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing a dirt floor scattered with debris. At first glance, I thought I was looking at old elk bones. God knows I'd seen enough of those over the years. But these were different. The long bone partially buried in the dirt had a curvature I recognized from basic anatomy, a human femur. My light trembled as I swept it across the ground, revealing more fragments, a section of what could only be a pelvis. Smaller bones that might have been fingers or toes. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a root, the thud of my pack hitting. The ground sounded impossibly loud in the silence. These had to be Price's remains. The location, the timeline, everything fit. But the implications of finding him here, in this structure that no human had built. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to document the scene. The bones, the structure, the GPS coordinates. The authorities would need all of it. But my service, bars had disappeared completely. I was too deep in the valley, too far from civilization. The light was failing fast now, the shadows between the trees growing longer and darker. I needed to mark this location precisely and get out while I could, still navigate safely. But as I stood there, forcing myself to be methodical despite the cold sweat running down my back, I couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was bigger than just solving a 7-year-old missing persons case. This wasn't a natural death. The bones hadn't been scattered by scavengers. They were deliberately placed inside this impossible structure. And something about their arrangement, the way they rested in the dirt, suggested they hadn't been disturbed since being put there. I forced myself to be systematic, to think like the hunter I was, rather than give in to the panic clawing at my chest. Moving in a careful grid pattern, I swept my headlamp beam across the ground inside and around the structure. The pine needles formed a thick carpet, years of accumulation that could hide anything. About 3 feet from the bones, something synthetic caught the light, a flash of faded green fabric. I knelt down, using a stick to carefully brush away the needles. A Forest Service jacket emerged from the debris, the material torn along one sleeve and across the back. The patches were still visible, though weathered and discolored. The name tag was gone, but I knew it had been Price's. My hands were steady now, steadier than they should have been. Maybe it was the training kicking in, all those years of reading sign and tracking game. I kept searching, methodically expanding my sweep. The rusted canteen appeared next, half buried under more needles near the back of the structure. The metal was deeply corroded, but the Forest Service logo was still barely visible through the rust. Then I found the boot. It was still perfectly laced, as if its owner had simply stepped out of it. The leather was weathered but largely intact, protected from the worst of the elements by the structure's crude roof. A standard-issue hiking boot, the kind rangers wore on patrol. The size and style matched what had been listed in Price's missing person report. I remembered studying those details obsessively during the search, like everyone else in Libby who'd volunteered to look for him. Sat back on my heels trying to make sense of what I was seeing. If Price had died from exposure or injury, his gear would have been scattered by animals. Bears and cougars would have dragged things away. Mountain weather would have spread lightweight items across half the valley. But everything was here, contained. Within or near this structure, the bones, the jacket, the canteen, the boot, all gathered and placed with what felt like purpose. My mind kept circling back to the construction itself, those massive logs that would have taken significant strength to move and position. The careful stripping of bark from the smaller branches, the size of it all, scaled for something much larger than human proportions. I'd seen plenty of death in these mountains over the years. Hikers who took wrong turns, climbers who pushed too far, even the aftermath of predator attacks. But this was different. This felt deliberate, organized, almost ceremonial. The temperature was dropping rapidly now as night approached, and my headlamp beam caught swirls of my breath in the air. I needed to document everything before dark. Pulling out my phone again, I forced myself to take clear, steady photos of each item exactly as I'd found it. The authorities would need to understand the precise layout, the careful placement that spoke of intention rather than accident. I returned at first light, my truck grinding up the logging road as frost crackled under the tires. The morning was sharp and clear, but something felt different. Maybe it was knowing what waited in that lean-to, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed deeper between the trees. I'd barely slept, spending half the night making calls. First to the sheriff's office, then to Forest Service dispatch. They wanted the site marked clearly for the recovery team. Simple enough task. Just hang some flagging tape and log the GPS coordinates. Should have taken an hour, tops. The hike in felt longer this time. Every few minutes, I caught myself stopping to look over my shoulder. The forest that had been my second home for decades now pressed in close, unfamiliar. The birds were quiet again, but not like yesterday. This silence had weight to it, like the air before a storm. About halfway to the site, I heard the first knock. A dull, wooden sound, like someone tapping a baseball bat against a tree trunk. It echoed from somewhere up the ridge, once, twice, 3 times in steady rhythm. I froze, listening hard. After 30 seconds, it came again, fainter this way, as if whatever made the sound had moved further north. I'd heard stories about tree knocking, of course. Every hunter in these parts had. But I'd always filed those away with big footprints and campfire tales. Now, standing there with my heart hammering against my ribs, those stories didn't seem quite so easy to dismiss. The smell hit me as I approached the clearing, a heavy, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something earthier, something wild. It hadn't been there yesterday, I was certain of that. My nose had been trained by years of tracking game. I would have noticed it. The lean-to looked exactly as I'd left it, but the air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I worked quickly, tying bright orange flagging tape at chest height to mark a path in from the nearest landmark. My hands were steady, but sweat ran down my back despite the morning chill. The knocking continued sporadically, moving in a rough circle around my position. Never close enough to pinpoint, but never quite fading away. Sometimes single knocks, sometimes that same rhythmic pattern of three. Once, from the opposite ridge, something answered with a similar cadence. As I checked the GPS coordinates against my map, that musty odor grew stronger. The hair on my neck stood up, and I knew with the same certainty that tells a prey animal when it's being stalked, that I wasn't alone. Whatever had built this structure, whatever had gathered Price's remains, was still here, still watching. I finished marking the site as quickly as I could while maintaining accuracy. The recovery team would need clear directions, and I wasn't about to let my growing unease compromise that responsibility. But every instinct screamed at me to move, to get back to open ground and civilization. The knocking had faded to sporadic, distant thuds when I noticed a game trail branching off toward a shadowed draw. Something about the way the vegetation was pushed aside caught my attention. Not the usual deer or elk pattern, but wider, as if something substantial had shouldered through. I hesitated, checking my watch. The recovery team wouldn't arrive for hours yet, and my GPS marking was complete. Professional curiosity won out. I'd spent decades reading sign. It was second nature to investigate unusual tracks. 20 yards down the trail, the ground dipped into a small depression where seasonal runoff had left patches of dark soil between the pine needles. That's where I saw them. Impressions that stopped me cold. At first, my brain tried to make sense of them as bear tracks, but the shape was all wrong. These were longer, wider than any print I'd seen in my life, with distinct toes splayed out like fingers. I knelt down, my hands shaking slightly, as I cleared away some debris for a better look. The track had to be at least 16 inches long, deeply pressed into the earth. Whatever made it had serious weight behind it. The stride length between prints was massive, easily twice what a person would leave. My pack held a small digital camera, standard gear for documenting hunting success. I reached for it, then stopped. Years of experience told me to document everything, to preserve evidence. But another part of me, the part that remembered raised eyebrows and dismissive looks when others had reported similar findings, made me hesitate. What would I even do with photos? Show them to the sheriff's department along with Price's remains? They'd write me off as another mountain crackpot, and any credibility I had about finding the ranger would evaporate. Besides, these tracks were already weathered, probably from recent rain. They'd be easy to dismiss as water damage or overlapping animal prints. I traced the outline with my finger, feeling the depth and definition. The impression was clear enough that I could make out individual toe marks, the hint of a heel. This wasn't some random depression or trick of erosion. Something had walked here, something heavy enough to sink deep into packed earth, something that moved on two legs. The musky odor was stronger in the draw, making my nose wrinkle, fresh this time, not just lingering like before. I found myself looking up at the ridge lines, scanning the timber. The forest felt closer, more confined, branches hanging low enough to brush against my shoulders. I stood up, deliberately not, taking out my camera. Some evidence was better left undocumented, at least until I could figure out what to do with it. The tracks would wash away with the next rain, and maybe that was for the best. I had enough to deal with, reporting Price's remains. No need to complicate things with prints nobody would believe anyway. It took me nearly 2 hours of hiking to get a single bar of cell service. I had to climb above the tree line, where the October wind cut straight through my jacket. My hands were stiff with cold as I dialed the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office. "This is Caleb Hartley," I said, watching my breath cloud in the air. I need to report a discovery in the Yak Valley. I believe I've found Ranger Daniel Price's remains. The dispatcher's professional tone shifted slightly at the name. She took my coordinates carefully, twice confirming the numbers. Within minutes, she patched me through to Sheriff Mark Ellison himself. Mr. Hartley, Ellison's voice crackled through the weak connection. Can you describe exactly what you found? I kept my report factual. The lean-to structure, the bones, the Forest Service jacket, and the canteen. I mentioned nothing about the tracks or the knocking sounds. The sheriff listened without interruption, only asking about access points and terrain conditions. Stay where you have service, he instructed. Search and rescue is mobilizing. We'll need you to guide us in. The SAR team arrived first, 2 hours later, their yellow jackets bright against the darkening timber. Sheriff Ellison, followed with 2 deputies, carrying evidence collection kits and cameras. I led them down to the site, watching their faces as the crude shelter came into view. The sheriff's expression remained neutral as he surveyed the scene, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He'd been involved in the original search 7 years ago. This wasn't just another case for him. Animal disturbance is significant, one of the deputies noted, photographing the scattered bones, consistent with regional scavenger patterns. They worked methodically, bagging items and logging positions. The language they used was careful, clinical. Environmental exposure, natural decomposition, wildlife interaction. Every observation seemed chosen to fit a conventional narrative. Sheriff Ellison pulled me aside while his team worked. The family's been waiting a long time for closure, he said quietly. We appreciate you reporting this properly. There was something in his tone, not quite a warning, but close, like he was suggesting which version of events would be most helpful. I nodded, understanding the unspoken message, just doing what anyone would do. The recovery took hours. They photographed and collected every bone, every scrap of clothing, every piece of equipment. But no one mentioned the size of the shelter, how the logs were woven together with a precision that spoke of purpose. No one commented on the strange arrangement of the remains, or why Price's gear had been stacked so deliberately. As they packed up their evidence bags, I heard one deputy mention mountain conditions and unfortunate accidents. Sheriff Ellison nodded along, but I caught him studying the shelter's construction with a furrowed brow before they marked it for later demolition. The official story was already taking shape. A ranger lost in bad weather, succumbing to exposure, his remains scattered by animals, clean, simple, explainable. I kept quiet, watching them build their reasonable narrative while studiously avoiding anything that didn't fit. I made camp about a quarter-mile from the recovery site, close enough to assist if needed, but far enough to give the investigators space to work. The autumn dusk came early, painting the ridgelines in deep purple, while the valleys below already lay in shadow. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun dipped behind the mountains. My small camp stove hissed as I heated water. For coffee, more for warmth than caffeine, the investigators' voices carried faintly through the timber. Professional, methodical, discussing logistics for transporting evidence. I checked my watch. 6:45 p.m. They'd likely work until full dark with their portable lights. The first knock came just as I lifted the coffee to my lips, a sharp, wooden crack that echoed off the opposite ridge. I froze, counting seconds until a second knock answered from further up the valley. The sound was identical to what I'd heard earlier, too precise to be random, too measured to be natural. One of the deputies called out, "Hear that?" Probably elk moving through. But elk don't make those sounds. Not like that. Not with that deliberate rhythm. The knocks continued, moving in a pattern around our position. 3 quick strikes, then 2 slow ones. A pause. Then the sequence repeated from a different direction. The hair on my neck stood up as I realized we were being triangulated. A massive crash erupted from the ridge above camp, the sound of something heavy moving through brush and snapping branches. not the careful step of an elk or the lumbering gait of a grizzly. This was powerful, purposeful movement. "Just a bear," Sheriff Ellison called out, but his hand rested on his sidearm. Pretty common this time of year. The crashing grew closer, working its way down the slope toward the recovery site. Small trees swayed and cracked in its wake. The investigators clustered closer to their vehicles, their headlamps cutting bright cones through the growing darkness. They were trying to maintain their professional demeanor, but I could see the tension in their postures. Another series of knocks, closer now. The heavy movement stopped, as if waiting for a response. The forest fell into an unnatural silence. No birds, no small animals, not even wind in the branches. Just that waiting stillness I'd felt before. "We should wrap this up," one of the deputies suggested, trying to keep his voice casual. "Light's almost gone anyway." Sheriff Ellison nodded, but his eyes kept scanning the tree line. "Let's secure what we have and clear out before full dark." The knocking started again, this time from multiple directions at once. The rhythm was faster, more insistent. Whatever was up there wasn't just observing anymore, it was communicating, marking its territory, warning us away from what we'd found. I watched the investigators hurry to pack their equipment, their movements sharp and efficient. They maintained their professional vocabulary, standard wildlife activity, and normal forest sounds. But their actions told a different story. They knew, just as I did, that nothing natural was orchestrating this display. The crashing sounds resumed, closer still, accompanied by the sharp crack of splintering wood. Something was pressing in, tightening the circle around the recovery site, around the place where Price's remains had lain undisturbed for 7 years, until I stumbled upon them. As the investigators worked to document the site before darkness fell completely, Deputy Ortiz called out from about 30 yards west of the lean-to structure. "Sheriff, you might want to take a look at this." I followed Sheriff Ellison over to where she stood, her flashlight beam sweeping across a line of damaged saplings. Young lodgepole pines, maybe 4 or 5 inches thick, were snapped clean through at about chest height. Not splintered or torn, but broken with surprising precision. "There's more," she said, moving her light in an arc. "They form a kind of circle around the whole area." She was right. As we followed the pattern, it became clear that dozens of saplings had been systematically broken, creating what looked like a deliberate boundary around where we'd found Price's remains. The breaks were old, weathered grey, but the pattern was unmistakable. "Storm damage," Ellison said firmly, though his eyes lingered on the consistent height of the breaks. "We get heavy snow up here, especially in spring. Trees snap all the time." Deputy Ortiz crouched to examine one of the breaks more closely. "Sir, these aren't random. Look at the spacing. They're almost evenly distributed, and they all face inward, toward the site." I'd seen plenty of storm-damaged trees in my years of hunting. This was different. The breaks were too uniform, too purposeful. It reminded me of the bent saplings I'd noticed earlier, but this felt more deliberate, like a message or a marker. "Document it," Ellison ordered, his tone clipped. "But keep the speculation out of the official report. Last thing we need is another round of Bigfoot hunters trampling through here once word gets out about Price." Deputy Ortiz caught my eye as the sheriff walked away. She lowered her voice. "Something about this feels set, doesn't it? Like whatever did this wanted to mark the territory." I nodded, grateful someone else was willing to acknowledge the obvious. "You've worked other scenes. Does this look like normal animal activity to you?" "No," she admitted, taking photos of the broken saplings. "But that's not what's going in my report. Can't put down what we can't explain." The divide was clear, between what they could officially acknowledge and what they were actually seeing, between maintaining professional skepticism and confronting evidence that defied easy explanation. I understood their position. Who would want their name attached to a report suggesting something impossible? But as I watched them document the scene, carefully avoiding certain conclusions, I couldn't help but think of Daniel Price. Had he seen these same signs? Had he followed them to some truth that cost him his life? The broken saplings felt like a boundary line, a warning that we were pushing up against something that preferred to remain hidden. The knocking sounds continued intermittently from the ridgeline, but no one mentioned them anymore. It was easier to pretend we weren't all hearing the same thing, easier to focus on the practical work of evidence collection and chain of custody. But I could see it in their posture, in the way they kept glancing up at the darkening trees. They felt it, too, the weight of unspoken knowledge, the burden of seeing something they couldn't explain away. As the light faded, one of the evidence techs made a discovery that changed everything. "Got something here!" she called out, her flashlight beam catching, a glint of metal about 40 feet up the slope from the lean-to. We gathered around as she carefully approached what turned out to be a trail camera, still firmly strapped to a thick pine trunk. The housing was weathered, coated in a film of green algae that spoke to long exposure. My breath caught when I recognized the make, a Bushnell trophy cam, the same model Price had been known to use for wildlife surveys. The tech worked methodically, photographing the camera's position before removing it. The SD card was still inside, protected from the elements by the sealed housing. Sheriff Ellison immediately ordered it bagged as evidence, but I caught the tech's expression as she checked the small LCD screen on the back of the camera. "What did you see?" I asked later, when we'd returned to the command post they'd set up at the nearest Forest Service access road. The tech, Sarah, according to her vest, was hunched over a laptop in the back of a mobile unit, the camera's memory card plugged into a reader. She glanced around before answering, making sure we were alone. Most of the card was corrupted. Moisture damage, probably, but there's one frame. She trailed off, then turned the screen slightly so I could see. The image was grainy night vision, the characteristic green tint making everything look ghostly. At first glance, it seemed to show only trees and understory. But at the frame's edge, partially cut off, was a figure that made my skin crawl. Tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders that couldn't belong to any bear. The blur suggested a movement, but even frozen, the proportions were wrong for anything I knew lived in these woods. Sarah quickly closed the image file. "I have to turn this over to the sheriff," she said quietly. "It'll probably never make it into the official report. You understand?" I nodded, unable to shake what I'd seen. The figure had been massive, yes, but it was the sense of purpose in its stance that disturbed me most. This wasn't some animal wandering past a camera. The way it was positioned, it seemed to be watching, monitoring the very spot where Price's remains were found. Later that evening, I overheard Ellison on the phone with someone from the county office. "Corrupted memory card, nothing usable," he was saying. No images to release to the press. Just document it as equipment recovered from the scene." I understood the decision. Who would benefit from that image becoming public? It would only fuel speculation, draw thrill seekers, make a circus of what should be treated as a death investigation. But knowing it existed, knowing others had seen it too, that changed things. It meant I wasn't alone in what I'd been experiencing, wasn't imagining the weight of something watching from these woods. The image haunted me as I lay in my tent that night, the proportions of that figure playing against my closed eyelids. I thought about Price, about what he might have captured on that camera in his final days, about what knowledge he might have taken with him. The recovery operation wrapped up as dusk approached. I watched the last Forest Service truck disappear down the access road, leaving me alone with my decision to spend one final night in the valley. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I needed closure. Something to mark the end of this chapter that had started with a simple elk hunt and evolved into something far darker. I made camp about a quarter-mile from where we'd found Price's remains, choosing a small clearing that offered decent sightlines through the timber. The temperature had dropped sharply, and my breath fogged in the beam of my headlamp as I secured the tent and gathered firewood. The routine tasks felt different now, weighted with new meaning. The fire helped, its light pushing back the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. I heated a meal of freeze-dried stew, barely tasting it as I watched shadows dance at the edge of the firelight. The woods had gone quiet again, that unnatural silence my father used to warn about. the kind that feels like something holding its breath. It started around 10 o'clock. I just crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the fire to burn down to coals, when I heard the first footfall. Heavy, deliberate. The sound of something massive moving with careful intent through the undergrowth beyond my tent. The steps circled, slowly, stopping every few yards. Each pause lasted exactly long enough for me to wonder if it had gone, before the next footfall landed with precise purpose. The pattern was too regular for any animal I knew. This was calculated movement, designed to let me track its progress around my position. My hand found my rifle, though I knew I wouldn't use it. The creature, and I was certain now that's what it was, kept to the darkness just beyond where my straining eyes could penetrate. The musky odor I'd noticed days earlier returned, stronger now, mixing with a sharp, animal scent that made my nose burn. The circling continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes the steps would retreat, growing fainter until I almost convinced myself it was over. Then they'd return, closer, accompanied by the crack of branches that no normal wildlife could break with such ease. The sound of its breathing reached me during the closest passes, deep, rhythmic respirations that spoke of massive lungs. I lay perfectly still, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin despite the sweat soaking my clothes. The tent's thin walls felt absurdly inadequate, but I knew that running would be worse. This was a display of dominance, a message being delivered with methodical precision. I was the intruder here. This valley belonged to something else, something that had claimed it long before the first survey teams pushed through these mountains. When dawn finally began to pale the sky, the footsteps withdrew for the last time. The forest remained silent for another hour before the first birds tentatively resumed their calls. Only then did I allow myself to move, to pack my gear with trembling hands and begin the long walk out. I left the valley that morning with a bone-deep certainty about two things. Daniel Price had discovered something in these woods that cost him his life, and whatever it was had just warned me away with deliberate restraint. The fact that I was allowed to leave felt less like luck and more like a decision made by something ancient and territorial, something that could have chosen otherwise. I spent 3 days in Libby before I could bring myself to record this account. The sheriff's office had already released their statement about Daniel Price. Accidental exposure complicated by wildlife disturbance. Neat and clean, fitting everything into boxes that wouldn't disturb anyone's sleep. But I knew I had to put down what really happened, not for attention or fame, but because someone needs to speak the truth. I chose the library study room to make my recording. The familiar smell of old books and quiet whispers helped steady my nerves as I set up my phone and began speaking into its microphone. My voice sounded strange to my own ears as I recounted finding the remains, the structure, the footprints that no one wanted to discuss. Word spreads fast in small towns. Within days of my return, I'd caught fragments of conversations at the Dirty Shame Saloon, at the gas station, at the grocery store. Everyone had their theory about Price's death. Some blamed grizzlies. Others suggested he'd gotten lost in a storm. A few older residents spoke in hushed tones about things their grandparents had warned them about, creatures that had always lived in the deeper valleys. Sheriff Ellison called me in for a follow-up statement yesterday. He was polite but firm about keeping the official narrative simple. Mountain country claims people sometimes, he said, shuffling papers on his desk. Best not to complicate things. But I saw how his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine when he said, it. The trail camera photo never made it into any report. When I asked about it, the deputy who'd found it just shook his head and changed the subject. That blurred image haunts me. The massive shape at the edge of night vision, too tall and too deliberate to be anything we're supposed to believe in. I've spent my life in these mountains. I know how they can kill. Hypothermia, falls, avalanches, predators. But what happened to Price, what I encountered in that valley, wasn't any of those things. It was something older, something that's always been there, watching and waiting. The bent saplings, the structured shelter, the precise way those footsteps circled my camp. These weren't random events. The wilderness doesn't just lose people. When someone vanishes into those deep forests, there's always a reason. Sometimes that reason has intelligence behind it, territory it's defending, boundaries it once respected. The locals understand this, even if they won't say it outright. They know which valleys to avoid, which trails seem to lead nowhere good. I'm not looking to convince anyone or start some kind of crusade. This isn't about proving anything. It's about warning others who might venture too deep, who might cross lines they don't know exist. The evidence is there for those willing to see it, in the silence that falls too suddenly, in the tracks that don't match anything in our textbooks, in the stories every mountain town keeps but rarely shares. Price found something out there, or maybe something found him. Either way, I know now why my father used to say, some parts of the mountains aren't meant for us. There are places where we're not the apex predator, where being human doesn't grant any special privilege. Those places belong to something else, something that watches from the trees, unseen, but never absent. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.